Hey there, welcome to Quiet History. I'm happy to have you here. Tonight, we're traveling deep into the jungles of Central America to a civilization that built massive cities, advanced knowledge, and a thriving society. And then it disappeared. No single war, no clear disaster, just silence. So what really happened to the Maya?
Beneath the surface of what appears to be unbroken wilderness, an entire civilization waits in patient silence, its stones still warm from a sun that set 1,000 years ago, its reservoirs now filled with roots and sediment, its causeways traced only by the faintest paleness in the undergrowth. And to understand how all of that came to be, one must first stand at the very beginning, in a landscape that held no cities yet, only the deep, breathing patience of the jungle itself. The Petén Basin of northern Guatemala stretches outward in every direction beneath a canopy so continuous and so vast that it resembles, from any elevation above it, a living ocean, a slow, breathing expanse of ceiba and mahogany and Roman trees, whose crowns press together in an unbroken surface of green that rolls gently with the contours of the limestone ridges beneath. This is the landscape at its most primordial, before the first stone was shaped and set, before the first causeway was laid across the soft jungle floor, before any human intention had yet left its mark on the ancient geography of the lowlands. The canopy here rises to extraordinary heights, the great ceiba trees, sacred in the cosmological understanding of the people who would eventually build their cities, among them lifting their broad crowns, 60 meters and more above the shadowed understory, their buttressed roots spreading across the forest floor in great, radiating fins of pale wood. Below the canopy, the light arrives not as brightness, but as suggestion. Dawn in this landscape is a gradual event, unhurried and layered, a slow suffusion of amber warmth that descends through the canopy in long shifting columns, each shaft of early light carrying within it the slow drift of pollen and the fine mist of evaporating dew. The forest floor, at this hour, exists in a world of its own making, cool and shadowed, and alive with the soft percussion of moisture, falling from leaf to leaf in the stillness before full morning. Ferns spread their fronds across the limestone outcrops that push through the thin soil in irregular formations, their surfaces already colonized by mosses and lichens that spread in slow, patient patterns across the stone. Orchids cling to the upper branches of the great trees in cascading arrangements, their roots wrapped around the bark in a grip that has taken years to establish and will endure for decades more. The sounds of this landscape at dawn are layered and precise in their geography. From the highest reaches of the canopy, the resonant calls of howler monkeys roll outward across the treetops in long, carrying waves that seem to travel not through air, but through the canopy itself, one group answering another across distances that would take hours to walk. Beneath that deep, rolling chorus, the liquid notes of unseen birds move through the middle layers of the forest, melodic, unhurried, each call answered by silence before the next begins. And beneath all of this, at the level of the forest floor itself, the smallest sounds are audible in the pauses between the larger ones. The soft movement of leaf litter disturbed by something small and unhurried, the distant drip of water finding its way through limestone into one of the countless underground passages that honeycomb the bedrock of this entire region. That bedrock is itself a landscape of extraordinary complexity and age. The limestone that underlies the entire Petén Basin and extends northward across the Yucatan Peninsula was laid down by ancient seas across millions of years, built from the accumulated shells and skeletons of marine organisms that lived and died in shallow tropical waters long before any terrestrial life had yet imagined the forms it would eventually take. This stone is porous and honeycombed in its deeper layers, riddled with passages and chambers, carved by the slow dissolution of calcium carbonate in slightly acidic groundwater, a process that has been ongoing since the sea retreated and left this limestone plateau exposed to rainfall and time. The result is a landscape that holds water in hidden abundance, channeling it through underground rivers that emerge as springs at the base of escarpments, pooling it in the circular openings of cenotes where the cave ceilings have collapsed to reveal the water table below, storing it in the porous rock itself in quantities that would prove essential to every civilization that ever attempted to establish itself in this seemingly waterless terrain. It is into this landscape, ancient, patient, layered with geological time, that the earliest evidence of human presence appears not as a sudden arrival, but as the most gradual of accumulations. The traces are subtle at first, visible only to those who know precisely where and how to look. A forest path that runs slightly too straight for a natural game trail, its edges marginally cleared of the undergrowth that presses in from both sides. A limestone outcrop around which the ferns and low shrubs have been removed, the bare stone surface showing the faint marks of tools that shaped its edges with deliberate intention. A modest platform of stacked and fitted stone, rising perhaps a meter from the forest floor, its surface is already beginning to acquire the moss and lichen that will eventually make it indistinguishable from the natural outcrops around it if left unattended, but which, for now, speaks clearly of human hands and human purpose. These early constructions, modest and tentative by the standards of what would eventually rise from this same landscape, represent the opening of a conversation between human intention and the living world of the jungle. A conversation that would continue, growing ever more elaborate and ambitious across the centuries of the pre-classic period and into the early classic. The limestone of the Petén proved amenable to shaping, soft enough when freshly quarried to be worked with stone tools, hardening as it dried and aged into a material of considerable durability. The jungle itself provided the raw materials for the plaster that would eventually coat these stone surfaces, lime burned from limestone in great fires mixed with water and organic binders to produce a smooth, brilliant white surface that reflected the tropical sun with an intensity that must have been visible from considerable distances across the flat landscape of the lowlands. As the pre-classic period advanced toward its close and the early classic began to take shape, the landscape itself underwent a transformation that was gradual in its individual steps, but cumulative in its effect. Clearings widened as forest was removed to make way for agriculture and construction, the edges of the jungle retreating incrementally from the growing centers of human activity. The first causeways of white limestone gravel began to appear, the sakebiu, or white roads that would eventually connect plazas within cities, and in some cases extend for kilometers through the jungle to connect one settlement to another. These causeways cut through the undergrowth with a purposefulness that the forest paths of earlier centuries had only suggested, their pale surfaces catching the light in a way that made them visible, even in the dimness of the jungle interior, guiding movement through the landscape with quiet authority. Above the canopy, the horizon began to change. The first tentative pyramidal forms rose above the tree line, not yet the soaring monuments of the classic peak, but modest platforms of accumulated stone and fill that nonetheless interrupted the unbroken green horizon with the unmistakable geometry of human making. These early structures were oriented with a care that suggests astronomical awareness. From the very beginning of the tradition, their axes aligned to the rising and setting points of celestial bodies whose movements would become the organizing framework of an entire civilization's understanding of time and cosmos. The jungle around these emerging centers continued to press inward, requiring constant maintenance to keep the clearings open, the causeways passable, the agricultural fields productive, a relationship between human effort and natural process that would define the Maya world for centuries to come. The agricultural landscape that developed alongside these early urban centers was itself a transformation of extraordinary ambition. The Ramon tree, whose nuts provided a reliable and storable food source, was cultivated and encouraged throughout the forests surrounding the settlements. The Milpa system of cultivation, clearing, burning, planting, and allowing fields to rest and regenerate, was practiced across the landscape in a rotating pattern that maintained soil fertility while gradually expanding the area under cultivation. In the low-lying areas where seasonal flooding created swampy terrain, the first raised field systems began to appear. Long, narrow platforms of piled earth separated by drainage channels, converting marginal wetland into productive agricultural geometry that would eventually feed populations of considerable size. The water management systems that would become one of the great engineering achievements of the classic Maya world had their origins in these early centuries as well. The natural topography of the limestone landscape was carefully observed and understood. The way rainwater moved across the surface, the locations of natural depressions where water collected, the positions of the underground passages where surface water disappeared into the rock. Early reservoirs were constructed by lining natural depressions with plaster to prevent the rapid absorption of collected rainwater into the porous limestone below, creating the first of what would eventually become sophisticated systems of water storage capable of sustaining large urban populations through the long dry seasons of the tropical year. The jungle at dusk in this early landscape settles into its nighttime character with the same unhurried gradualness with which it had greeted the morning. The amber light that is filtered through the canopy all day deepens toward gold, and then toward the warm darkness of early evening, the shadows beneath the great trees merging and deepening until the forest floor exists in a darkness that is complete and soft and full of quiet sound. Above the clearings that now interrupt the canopy at increasing intervals, the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Venus brilliant in the west, the Pleiades rising at the eastern horizon, the broad river of the Milky Way beginning to assert itself against the deepening blue overhead. Fireflies appear above the clearings in the early darkness, their cold light drifting in slow, irregular patterns above the pale limestone gravel of the first causeways, above the modest stone platforms that mark the beginnings of what will become great cities, above the agricultural fields where the ramen and maize and squash grow in the darkness with the same patient intention that characterizes everything in this landscape. The canopy settles into its nighttime chorus, the insects finding their voices, the nocturnal birds beginning their calls, the howler monkeys quiet now after their dawn declarations, the forest breathing in the darkness with the deep, slow rhythm of something immeasurably old and patient. Something immense is beginning to stir within this ancient landscape, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the same gradual accumulation of intention and effort that characterizes the limestone itself, layer upon layer, century upon century, building toward a height and complexity that no single moment of its construction could have predicted or fully imagined. The stones are being gathered, the causeways are being laid, the first alignments with the stars are being observed and recorded, and the jungle, ancient and patient and entirely indifferent to human ambition, continues to breathe around and through and beneath all of it, waiting with the unhurried confidence of something that knows, with the certainty of deep geological time, that it will still be here long after the last stone has been shaped and set and named. There is a moment just before full sunrise at Tikal, when the pyramids emerge from the darkness, not gradually, but all at once, their limestone surfaces catching the first horizontal light of morning, while the jungle below remains entirely submerged in shadow, and in that suspended instant, the great temples appear to float above the forest like stone islands in a green and breathing sea, their presence so complete and so deliberate that the jungle itself seems to have arranged itself around them in deference. The classic Maya period, spanning roughly from 250 to 600 AD, in its early and middle phases, represents one of the most sustained and extraordinary episodes of urban and intellectual achievement in the ancient world, and nowhere is that achievement more legible in the landscape than at Tikal, rising from the flat limestone shelf of the Petén Basin in northern Guatemala. Temple I, known to later scholarship as the Temple of the Great Jaguar, rises to approximately 47 meters above the Great Plaza, a steep, narrow pyramid of 9 terraced platforms whose proportions seem to compress the vertical dimension of the sky itself, drawing the eye upward along its staircase with an insistence that feels less like architectural design and more like gravitational inevitability. Temple of Four, the tallest surviving pre-Columbian structure in the Americas at approximately 70 meters, rises above the western edge of the site complex, its rooftop cone, a latticed stone superstructure that adds height and visual drama to the temple summit, visible above the canopy from distances that would have made it a landmark across the entire flat landscape of the lowlands. The Great Plaza at Tikal is a vast open geometry of fitted limestone pavement, its surface worn smooth by centuries of tropical rain and the slow dissolution of its calcium carbonate surface. The plaza is flanked on its eastern and western ends by the two great pyramid temples, and on its northern edge by the North Acropolis, a complex of smaller temples and platforms had accumulated over centuries of construction and reconstruction, each new phase built directly over the previous one, in a layering of architectural intention that archaeologists have spent decades carefully unpacking. The scale of this open space, when considered against the dense jungle that surrounds it on every side, creates a quality of light and air that is entirely different from anything the forest offers. A broad, open brightness that falls without interruption across the pale limestone across the pavement, casting the sharp, geometric shadows of pyramid edges and stellar bases across the plaza floor in patterns that shift with the movement of the sun through the day. The cordled arch, the defining structural innovation of classic Maya architecture, appears throughout the palace complexes and ceremonial corridors of Tikal and every other great city of the period, and its presence in the landscape creates interior spaces of a particular and unmistakable character. Unlike the true Arch of Roman and later European construction, which distributes weight through a keystone and allows for broad, rounded openings, the corbelled arch achieves its span by cantilevering each successive course of stone slightly inward from both sides until the two faces nearly meet at the top, the weight of the structure above pressing down on each stone and holding the whole assembly in compression. The result is a narrow, soaring interior space, tall in proportion to its width, the walls rising steeply to a pointed apex that channels light and air in ways that feel simultaneously functional and ceremonial. The quality of illumination within these spaces shifting dramatically with the angle of the sun outside, moving from deep shadow to brilliant shafts of amber light as the day progresses. The palace corridors of Tikal's central acropolis extend through a complex of interconnected rooms and courtyards that accumulated across multiple centuries of construction, each phase adding new rooms and new levels to a structure that grew organically rather than according to any single master plan. The plastered walls of these corridors, originally painted in the deep reds and warm ochres that characterize classic Maya interior decoration, have lost most of their color to the centuries of humidity and biological growth that followed the city's abandonment, but the quality of the plasterwork itself remains legible. Smooth, carefully finished surfaces that speak of considerable technical skill and the investment of substantial labor in the refinement of interior spaces that would never be visible to the majority of the city's population. Moving westward across the Maya world to Palenque, the landscape changes dramatically, and the architecture responds to it with equal drama. Where Tikal rises from the flat limestone shelf of the Petanay with a vertical ambition that seems to compensate for the flatness of its setting, Palenque emerges from terraced hillsides above a valley of extraordinary lushness in the highlands of what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, its buildings arranged across a series of natural and artificial terraces that step down from the forested ridge above toward the valley floor below. The quality of light at Palenque is different from Tikal's, softer, more diffuse, filtered through the moisture that rises from the valley and clings to the hillsides in morning mist, giving the stone surfaces of the buildings a quality that shifts between warm amber in direct sunlight and the cooler, more luminous grey in the shade. The palace complex at Palenque rises in elegant tiers above a broad courtyard that catches the afternoon light in long, warm rectangles. Its 4-story tower, unique in classic Maya architecture, rising above the surrounding structures with a verticality that seems to reach toward the sky with particular intentionality. The tower's function remains a subject of scholarly discussion, with astronomical observation among the most frequently proposed explanations, and its position within the palace complex does indeed offer sightlines across the valley and toward the horizon that would have made it well suited to the careful observation of celestial events. The interior galleries of the palace are among the most refined interior spaces in the entire Maya world, their corbelled ceilings rising to considerable height, their walls covered with carved limestone panels depicting historical and cosmological narratives in a style of extraordinary elegance and precision. The Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque stands at the southwestern edge of the main plaza, its 9 terraced levels rising from a broad base to a summit temple whose rooftop comb once carried painted stucco decoration visible across the entire valley. The 9 levels of the pyramid correspond to the 9 levels of the Maya underworld, a cosmological encoding that is characteristic of classic Maya architecture in its integration of symbolic meaning into structural form so that the building itself becomes a statement about the nature of the cosmos and the position of the human world within it. Morning mist clings to the lower courses of the Temple of the Inscriptions in the early hours, rising from the valley below and pooling against the warm stone of the pyramid's base before the strengthening sun burns it away, leaving the limestone surfaces dry and warm and brilliant in the full tropical light. The hydraulic infrastructure of the great classic Maya cities represents an engineering achievement that is perhaps less visually dramatic than the pyramids, but no less remarkable in its ambition and execution. At Tikal, a system of at least 10 major reservoirs was constructed across the site, their basins carefully plastered to prevent the rapid absorption of collected rainwater into the porous limestone below, their catchment areas defined by the carefully engineered slopes of plazas and causeways that directed rainfall toward the reservoir openings with deliberate efficiency. The Great Tikal Reservoir, known in modern scholarship as the Palace Reservoir, could hold an estimated approximately 900,000 cubic meters of water, a quantity sufficient to sustain a substantial urban population through the long dry season of the tropical year, representing an investment of engineering intelligence and physical labor that speaks to the organizational capacity of classic Maya urban governance. The still surfaces of these reservoirs, when full, reflected the pyramid silhouettes above them in images that doubled the visual drama of the city's skyline, the stone monuments rising above, and their mirror images descending below the waterline. The whole composition framed by the jungle canopy that pressed in from every side. The raised agricultural fields of the lowland margins, visible from the air as long parallel ridges separated by drainage channels, transformed the swampy terrain at the edges of the great cities into productive agricultural geometry that extended the carrying capacity of the landscape well beyond what the bare, natural terrain would have supported. These fields required constant maintenance, the channels cleared of vegetation, the ridges rebuilt after flooding, the gay soil enriched with the organic material dredged from the channels, representing a continuous investment of agricultural labor that bound the rural landscape to the urban centers in relationships of mutual dependence. Far to the north, at Chichen Itza on the flat limestone plain of the northern Yucatan, the pyramid known as El Castillo. The Temple of Kukulkan embodies perhaps the most celebrated single moment of astronomical alignment in the entire Maya world. The pyramid rises in 9 terraced platforms to a summit temple, its 4 stairways each containing 91 steps, the total of 364 steps, plus the summit platform, equaling 365, the number of days in the solar year encoded in the very structure of the monument. At the moment of the spring equinox, as the afternoon sun descends toward the western horizon, the angle of light striking the northern staircase of El Castillo creates a rippling triangular shadow along the balustrade, a shadow that moves and shifts as the sun descends, creating the visual impression of a great serpent descending the staircase from the summit temple to the serpent head sculptures at the base, the entire effect lasting for approximately 34 minutes before the light shifts and the illusion dissolves. This alignment, the product of centuries of astronomical observation, translated into the precise geometry of stone construction, represents the fullest expression of what the classic Maya world achieved at its height. The integration of cosmological knowledge, mathematical precision, architectural ambition, and the patient labor of thousands into monuments that spoke simultaneously to the sky above and the earth below, encoding in stone and light and shadow a vision of the cosmos that was at once intellectually sophisticated and physically magnificent. The warm amber light of the equinox afternoon falls across the pale limestone of El Castillo staircase with the same quality it has carried for over 1,000 years, the shadow moving with the same precision, the serpent descending with the same unhurried inevitability, the geometry of the cosmos made visible in stone, patient and enduring, waiting for the light to find it again. The cities of the classic Maya world, at their height, were not merely collections of impressive buildings, but integrated landscapes of extraordinary complexity, environments in which the natural world and the built world have been woven together with such care and intelligence that the boundaries between them became difficult to locate. The jungle pressed in from every side, held at bay by continuous human effort, its presence always felt even at the center of the great plazas, in the quality of the air, in the sounds that drifted over the pyramid summits from the canopy beyond, in the roots that probed the edges of every pavement, and the vines that reached for every unattended wall. And above it all, the sky, vast, brilliant, and intimately known, arched from horizon to horizon, its movements tracked and recorded and encoded in the very stones of the cities below, the whole extraordinary civilization, oriented upward toward the celestial patterns that gave it its sense of time, its cosmological framework, and its enduring ambition to build something worthy of the sky's attention. In the great plaza at Copan, there are stone surfaces so densely inscribed with carved meaning that to stand before them in the raking light of early morning is to feel the weight of an entire civilization's intellectual life pressing outwards through the stone itself. Each glyph block a compressed universe of historical record and cosmological understanding, the whole surface alive with a language that took modern scholarship the better part of 2 centuries to begin to read with confidence, and which still, in its deepest registers, holds meanings that resist full translation. Copan, situated in the Motagua River valley of what is now western Honduras, occupies a landscape that differs markedly from the flat limestone shelves of the Petanay or the misty hillsides of Palanque. Here the terrain is more intimate in scale, a broad, flat valley floor enclosed by forested ridges, the river curving through agricultural bottomland with a gentleness that belies the erosive force it has applied to the site's eastern edge across the centuries since the city's abandonment. The stele and altars of Copan's great plaza represent perhaps the most intricate stone carving in the entire Maya architectural scale of Palenque's carved panels, or the monumental simplicity of Tikal's towering temples, but a density and refinement of sculptural detail that approaches the quality of jewelry work translated into the medium of volcanic tuff, the stone of the Copan Valley, that proved amenable to a level of carving precision that harder limestone could not have supported. In the early morning, when the sun is still low, and its light arrives at a nearly horizontal angle across the plaza surface, the carved faces of the Copan stelae come alive in a way that midday illumination entirely suppresses. The low light rakes across the relief carving with a precision that throws each glyph block into sharp contrast, the raised surfaces catching warm amber light, while the incised lines and recessed backgrounds fall into deep shadow, the whole surface resolving into a landscape of light and darkness that makes the stone seem to speak in a visual language of extraordinary clarity. Portrait sculptures emerge from this light with particular force, the elaborate headdresses of the figures depicted on the stele casting their own complex shadows across the glyph columns below, the whole composition shifting and deepening as the sun rises and the angle of illumination changes, the stone seeming to breathe with the movement of the light across it. The hieroglyphic writing system of the classic Maya was not, as earlier scholars sometimes assumed, a purely logographic or purely phonetic system, but rather a sophisticated combination of both: logograms that represented entire words or concepts combined with syllabic signs that could be used to spell words phonetically, the two systems operating simultaneously and interchangeably within a single inscription. This flexibility gave Maya scribes an expressive range that allowed them to write with considerable nuance, to record historical events with specific dates, to name individuals and their titles and their genealogical relationships, to describe ritual actions and their cosmological significance, and to embed within a single glyph block multiple layers of meaning that operated simultaneously on historical, mythological, and astronomical registers. The decipherment of this system, which advanced dramatically in the second half of the 20th century through the work of scholars including Yuri Norisov, Tatiana Proskoryakov, and David Stewart, among many others, transformed the understanding of the classic Maya from a civilization known primarily through its architecture to one whose historical record could be read with something approaching the directness of a written document. The physical presence of this writing system in the landscape of the classic Maya world was pervasive and varied in its material forms. Glyphs were carved into the limestone lintels that spanned the doorways of temples and palace rooms, their inscriptions positioned so that anyone passing beneath them moved through a threshold marked by historical and cosmological text. They were painted in brilliant colors on the plastered interior walls of buildings, the pigment mixed with organic binders and applied to the still damp plaster surface in a technique that, where conditions of preservation have been favorable, has survived across more than a millennium with remarkable fidelity of color and line. They were inscribed on jade objects, pendants, ear flares, the extraordinary jade mosaic masks that accompanied elite burials, the carving of glyphs into this hardest and most precious of materials, representing an investment of skill and labor that speaks to the value placed on the written word as a physical object as well as a carrier of meaning. Beyond the carved stone monuments and the painted walls, the writing system extended into the most intimate and perishable of materials, pressed into clay on ceramic vessels, painted on the bark paper pages of the folding books known as codices, applied to the surfaces of wooden objects and woven textiles in media that the tropical climate has almost entirely consumed across the centuries of abandonment. Only 4 Maya codices survive from the pre-Columbian period, their bark paper pages preserved by the dryness of the environments in which they were eventually deposited: the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex, and the recently authenticated Grolier Codex, and their contents reveal the range and sophistication of the written tradition that once existed across thousands of volumes now lost. The Dresden Codex, in particular, contains astronomical tables of extraordinary precision, tables tracking the synodic cycle of Venus across a period of approximately 584 days, accurate to within a fraction of a day over extended periods, and eclipse prediction tables that demonstrate a command of celestial mechanics achieved entirely through patient observation and the mathematical manipulation of long-term records. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the Dresden Codex and in the carved inscriptions of the great monuments was not abstract or purely intellectual in its orientation. It was intimately connected to the agricultural calendar, to the timing of ritual observances, and to the cosmological framework that gave the classic Maya world its sense of position within time and the universe. The planet Venus occupied a position of particular significance in this framework. Its appearances as morning star and evening star, tracked with meticulous care across the centuries, its synodic cycle of approximately 584 days interlocking with the 365-day solar year in a pattern that repeated exactly every 8 solar years, a relationship that the Maya calendar system encoded with elegant precision. The rising and setting points of Venus at its northern and southern extremes were marked in the architecture of observational structures so that the built environment itself became an instrument of astronomical measurement. The alignments of doorways and windows, calibrated to capture specific celestial events at specific moments in the calendar cycle. El Caracol at Chichen Itza, the round tower, whose name means snail in Spanish, a reference to the spiral staircase within, stands as the most explicitly astronomical of all surviving Maya architectural forms. Its circular plan is itself a departure from the rigidly rectangular geometry that characterizes virtually all other classic and post-classic Maya construction, and this departure is clearly intentional. The circle, in a world of right angles, announces its own special purpose. The windows of the upper chamber of El Coracal are aligned to capture the risings and setting points of Venus at its northern and southern extremes, the sight lines, through these narrow openings, defining precise directions in the landscape that correspond to specific moments in the Venus cycle. The platform on which El Caracal stands is itself oriented to astronomical alignments, its corners pointing to the cardinal directions with a precision that required careful surveying and deliberate construction. The whole structure, a physical embodiment of the relationship between the built world and the celestial world above it. The night sky above a jungle clearing in the classic Maya world was a landscape of extraordinary richness and clarity, a sky entirely unpolluted by any artificial light, the darkness of the tropical night, absolute beyond the small circles of firelight that marked human habitation. In this darkness, the Milky Way was not a faint suggestion, but a broad, luminous river of silver light arching from horizon to horizon, with a presence and definition that modern observers in light-polluted environments can barely imagine. A structural feature of the night sky, as prominent and as geographically specific as any mountain range or river valley in the terrestrial landscape below. The Maya understood the Milky Way as the world tree, the great cosmic axis around which the heavens rotated, its position in the sky at different seasons of the year, marking the passage of time in a calendar written in light across the darkness overhead. Venus blazed in the western sky after sunset with an intensity that made it the most prominent object in the heavens after the sun and moon. A brilliant, steady light that cast faint shadows on clear nights and whose appearances and disappearances as morning and evening star followed a pattern that the Maya astronomers tracked with the same careful attention they gave to the movements of the sun. The Pleiades, rising at a precise angle above the eastern horizon in the spring months, marked the beginning of the agricultural calendar, with a reliability that made them one of the most practically important of all celestial reference points. Their Heliacal rising, the moment when they first became visible above the horizon just before dawn, after their period of invisibility, signaling the approach of the rainy season and the time for planting. Jupiter and Saturn moved through the constellations of the ecliptic in their stately multi-year cycles, their positions recorded in the astronomical tables of the codices alongside those of Venus and the Moon. The whole complex choreography of the visible planets tracked and predicted with a precision that required both sophisticated mathematical tools and generations of accumulated observational records. The mathematical system that made this astronomical precision possible was itself one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world. The Maya independently developed a positional notation system, a system in which the value of a numeral depends on its position within a larger number, as in the modern decimal system, using a base 20 rather than base 10 framework, with a crucial innovation that placed it among the most sophisticated mathematical systems of the ancient world. The explicit use of 0 as a placeholder. This 0, represented in the inscriptions by a shell glyph, allowed the Maya mathematical system to handle numbers of arbitrary size with the same compact notation that makes modern arithmetic possible, a conceptual achievement that was reached independently in only a handful of mathematical traditions across the entire history of human thought. The long count calendar, which recorded dates as positions within a vast cycle of time, extending back to a mythological creation date, corresponding to approximately 3114 BC in a Gregorian calendar, expressed this mathematical sophistication in its most practically consequential form. Long count dates appear on stone monuments throughout the classic Maya world, each date recording the precise number of days elapsed since the creation date in a notation that used 5 positional units: the kin, unila, tun, katun, and baktun, to express dates within a cycle of approximately 5,125 years. These dates, carved in stone, with the same care and permanence as the portrait sculptures and historical narratives that accompanied them, anchored the events they recorded to a specific and unambiguous position within the flow of cosmic time, connecting the human world of political events and ritual observances to the vast temporal framework of the Maya cosmological understanding. The interlocking cycles of the Tzolk'in and Hab calendars, the 260-day ritual calendar, and the 365-day solar calendar meshed together in a pattern that repeated exactly every 52 years, a period known as the calendar round, that served as the basic unit of historical reckoning for most practical purposes. The visual expression of these interlocking cycles in the carved inscriptions, the glyph blocks for the Tzolk'in day and the Hab month, appearing together in paired notation, their combination specifying a unique position within the 52-year cycle, created a visual rhythm in the inscriptions that is recognizable even to those who cannot read the specific values. The paired calendar glyphs, appearing at the beginning of inscriptions with the regularity of a musical phrase that announces the key of the composition to follow. The night sky above Tikal, in the centuries when the city was at its height, received the patient attention of observers who understood it with an intimacy that no modern astronomer, however technically equipped, can fully replicate, because the modern astronomer does not live within the sky in the way that the classic Maya astronomers did, does not organize the entire framework of daily life and agricultural practice and political legitimacy and cosmological understanding around the movements of the celestial bodies overhead. The pyramids of Tikal, rising above the canopy as dark silhouettes against the blazing field of stars, were not merely tall buildings that happened to offer good views of the sky. They were instruments of observation and orientation, their summits positioned above the obscuring moisture and biological interference of the jungle canopy, their axes aligned to celestial reference points, their very existence a statement about the relationship between the human world below and the cosmic world above. The stone monuments, standing in patient silence in the plazas below those pyramids, held within their carved surfaces the accumulated record of centuries of that observation, the dates, the events, the astronomical correlations, the cosmological interpretations, a library written in stone and light, and the patient geometry of a civilization that understood with extraordinary clarity that it existed within time rather than outside it, and that the sky overhead was the most reliable clock, calendar, and cosmological map that any civilization could ever possess. In the darkness above Tikal, the Milky Way arches from horizon to horizon with the same unhurried permanence it has maintained across all the centuries since the last astronomer climbed those steep stone staircases to watch the sky from the summit temple. The carved glyphs on the stelae below stand in the darkness, their surfaces invisible, but their meaning still encoded in the stone. The long count dates still accurate, the astronomical tables still correct, the mathematical relationships still precise, waiting with the patient confidence of something built to endure, for the light to return and make them legible again. There is a particular quality to the light that falls on a reservoir margin during a dry season that has extended longer than expected. The pale limestone of the exposed basin walls, catching the afternoon sun with an almost painful brightness, the rings of receding water lines etched into the stone with the patient precision of a record keeper who marks each year's diminishment without comment or alarm. The still surface of the remaining water below, reflecting a sky of unbroken blue that offers no promise of the clouds that should, by this point in the seasonal cycle, have already begun to gather above the canopy. The late classic period, extending from roughly 600 to 800 AD, presents the Maya world at what appears on the surface to be its fullest expression of prosperity and achievement. The great cities at their maximum extent, the population of the southern lowlands, reaching densities that modern scholarship estimates at between 150 and 500 people per square kilometer in the most intensively settled areas, the construction of new monuments and new buildings, continuing at a pace that required the sustained mobilization of enormous quantities of human labor, stone and timber. And yet within this apparent flourishing, the called landscape itself was accumulating a record of pressures and stresses that would only become fully legible in retrospect, preserved in the sediment layers of ancient lake beds, in the oxygen isotope ratios of cave formations, in the pollen profiles of cores drilled from the silted floors of reservoirs, in the subtle changes in the zooarchaeological record that speak of a landscape being asked to provide more than it could indefinitely sustain. The hydrological landscape of the Maya lowlands is at its most fundamental level a landscape defined by the tension between abundance and scarcity, between the extraordinary volumes of rainfall that the tropical climate delivers across the wet season months, and the equally extraordinary capacity of the porous limestone bedrock to absorb and lose that water before it can be captured and stored. Across much of the Yucatan Peninsula, there are no permanent surface rivers. The water that falls as rain disappears almost immediately into the karst topography below, moving through underground passages and emerging, if it emerges at all, as springs at the base of escarpments, or in the open water of cenotes far from where it fell. The great engineering achievement of the classic Maya reservoir systems was precisely the interception of this water before it could disappear, the careful plastering of natural and artificial basins, the engineering of catchment surfaces, the construction of channels and weirs, the directed rainfall from the broad impermeable surfaces of plazas and causeways into the reservoir openings with deliberate efficiency. At Tikal, the reservoir system that had sustained the city to its centuries of growth represented one of the most sophisticated water management infrastructures in the ancient Americas, a network of interconnected basins whose combined storage capacity was carefully calibrated to the city's needs across the dry season months. During a normal year, the reservoirs filled during the wet season rains and drew down gradually through the dry months, their levels recovering with the return of the rains in a cycle that the city's engineers had observed and accommodated across generations of accumulated experience. But the limestone margins of these reservoirs, exposed each dry season as the water level dropped, recorded something that the engineers could observe but could not easily interpret across the span of a single lifetime. The pale rings of successive water lines, each marking the lowest point reached in a given dry season, showing across the decades a pattern of gradual deepening of dry seasons that ended with the reservoirs lower than the previous year's dry season had left them, of wet seasons that refilled the basins less completely than the ones before. The evidence for prolonged drought, preserved in the geological record of the Maya lowlands and surrounding regions, has accumulated substantially in recent decades as researchers have developed and refined the techniques for extracting paleoclimate information from cave formations, lake sediments, and marine cores. Stalagmites from caves in Belize and the Yucatan, whose oxygen isotope ratios record the relative heaviness of the rainfall that fed their growth across the centuries, show a pattern of increasing aridity beginning in the late 700 SAD and intensifying through the early 800s, a series of multi-year droughts interspersed with periods of partial recovery, the overall trend moving steadily toward conditions drier than anything the Maya cities had been engineered to accommodate. These droughts are not visible in the geological record as sudden events, but as gradual shifts. The isotope values changing slowly across decades, the signal of increasing aridity, accumulating layer by layer in the cave formations with the same patient incrementalism that characterizes every process in this landscape. The agricultural landscape of the late classic Maya world, viewed from the perspective of the physical evidence it has left in the terrain, tells a story of intensification that was simultaneously a response to growing population pressure and a source of new environmental stress. The raised field systems of the lowland margins, which had been expanding steadily since the early Classic period, extended during the late Classic into increasingly marginal terrain, the edges of swamps that flooded more deeply and more unpredictably than the core agricultural areas, the shallower soils of limestone ridges, where the depth of workable earth was limited and the risk of erosion correspondingly higher. At sites like Caracol in Belize and Copan in Honduras, the hillsides surrounding the urban cores were terraced during the late Classic period in a massive investment of agricultural engineering. The natural slopes cut into broad, level platforms retained by stone walls, the thin hillside soils redistributed and supplemented to create workable agricultural surfaces on terrain that the earlier generations of Maya farmers had largely left to forest. The terracing at Copan is particularly well documented in the archaeological record, and the sediment cores taken from the Copan River Valley floor tell a story that the terraces themselves only partially reveal. Beneath the layers of sediment that accumulated in the valley during and after the late Classic period, researchers have identified distinct strata of fine clay that record episodes of accelerated soil erosion from the surrounding hillsides. The washing away of agricultural soils during heavy rainfall events, the material that had taken centuries to accumulate on the hillside terraces moving in a single wet season into the valley drainage system and depositing there in layers that are now visible in the cores as pale bands of fine-grained material between the darker organic sediments of more stable periods. these erosion events increased in frequency and magnitude. Through the late Classic period, the sediment record showing a landscape undergoing hydrological stress, soils thinning on the hillsides, as successive erosion events removed material faster than biological processes could replace it, the agricultural productivity of the terraced hillsides declining incrementally with each season's losses. The broader landscape of the Maya lowlands during the late Classic period was, according to the accumulated evidence of palynological and zooarchaeological research, significantly more open than the dense jungle that covers it today. Pollen cores from lake beds across the region show a dramatic decline in forest pollen and a corresponding increase in the pollen of agricultural plants and weedy species during the late Classic period, a signal of extensive deforestation that transformed landscape from the mosaic of forest and cultivation that had characterized the earlier Classic period into something approaching an open agricultural landscape across large areas of the lowland heartland. This deforestation had consequences that extended well beyond the loss of timber and the exposure of soils to erosion. The removal of forest cover altered the local hydrology of the landscape, reducing the capacity of the terrain to retain moisture, increasing surface runoff during rain events, and potentially affecting the regional precipitation patterns that the agricultural system depended upon. The zooarchaeological record of the late Classic period adds another dimension to this picture of environmental change. Across the Maya domain, the bones of white-tailed deer, the most important large game animal in the Maya subsistence economy, decline in archaeological assemblages during the late Classic period, suggesting a combination of overhunting pressure and the loss of the forest edge habitat that deer prefer as the landscape became more extensively cleared and cultivated. The decline of deer in the archaeological record represents not merely the loss of a food source, but the loss of a material resource. Deer provided hides, bone tools, and antler for a range of practical applications, and its gradual disappearance from the faunal assemblages of late Classic sites speaks to a landscape that was being asked to provide more than it could sustainably offer. Within the great cities themselves, the late Classic period left a physical record of a landscape under pressure from its own success, a density of construction and occupation that transformed the urban environment in ways that are legible in the archaeological record, even centuries after the fact. New buildings were constructed over old ones in a layering that compressed the available space within the urban core. Plazas that had once offered broad open areas for assembly and ceremony gradually narrowed as new structures filled their margins, the geometry of the city becoming denser and more complex with each generation of construction. The quality of construction in some late Classic contexts shows evidence of the pressures that this intensification created. The careful fitting of dressed limestone blocks that characterizes the finest Classic Maya masonry, giving way in some structures to rougher work. The plaster coatings, thinner and less carefully finished, the overall impression, one of a building tradition maintaining its ambitions while working with resources that were becoming more difficult to mobilize at the scale that those ambitions required. The timber resources required for the burning of limestone to produce the plaster that coated every surface of every building in every Classic Maya city represented a demand on the surrounding forest that was, across the centuries of the Classic period, enormous in its cumulative scale. Experimental archaeology and engineering analysis suggest that the production of a single cubic meter of lime plaster required the burning of substantial quantities of wood, quantities that multiplied across the hundreds of thousands of square meters of plastered surface that the great cities represented translate into a demand for timber that would have required the clearing of considerable areas of forest for fuel alone, independent of the clearing required for agriculture and construction materials. The forest that surrounded the great cities was thus under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, cleared for agriculture, harvested for timber and fuel, hunted for game, and the cumulative effect of these pressures across the late Classic period was a landscape significantly more degraded than the one that the early Classic builders had inherited. The interplay between these environmental pressures and the climatic stress of the late 700s droughts created conditions that were, in the language of modern systems analysis, a compounding of vulnerabilities, each stress making the system less resilient in the face of the others, the whole becoming more fragile than the sum of its parts. A landscape with intact forest cover and deep agricultural soils could absorb a multi-year drought with far greater resilience than one with thin soils, reduced forest cover, depleted game populations, and reservoir systems already operating at reduced capacity after years of below-average rainfall. The scholarly consensus that has developed over the past 4 decades of research on the classic Maya collapse, reflected in the conclusions of a landmark gathering of Maya scholars that identified complex systems, interactions rather than any single cause, as the framework for understanding the period is precisely this understanding of compounding vulnerabilities, each factor amplifying the effects of the others in ways that no single factor could have produced alone. The landscape at dusk during one of the dry periods of the late 700s carries a quality that is entirely different from the amber warmth of the peak classic centuries. The sky above the great plazas is clear and still, a deep luminous blue fading toward the west where the sun has recently set, the first stars appearing in the darkening east with the same patient regularity they have always maintained, indifferent to the conditions of the world below. The air carries the dusty warmth of a season without rain, a warmth that is different in character from the lush, moisture-laden heat of the wet season, drier and more penetrating, carrying with it the faint scent of desiccated vegetation and the fine mineral dust of exposed limestone surfaces from which the thin soil cover has been washed away. The stone surfaces of the great plazas hold the heat of the day long after the sun has set, radiating it back into the still air of the evening with a warmth that is almost perceptible as a physical presence. The limestone, which has absorbed the tropical sun across the hours of the day, releasing that stored energy slowly into the cooling night. At the margins of the city, where the jungle presses in against the outermost structures, the canopy is slightly thinner than it was in earlier decades, the light reaching the forest floor in broader patches, the understory less dense, the shadows less deep. The jungle is quieter than usual in this dry season. The howler monkeys present, but less vocal. The bird calls less varied, the small sounds of the forest floor less frequent. The whole living system of the canopy registering, in its own patient way, the stress of a season that has asked more of it than the seasons before. The reservoir at the edge of the plaza catches the last light of the evening sky in its reduced surface, a smaller mirror than in previous years, its pale limestone margins exposed in broad rings that record the history of the receding waterline with the same dispassionate precision that the cave formations record in their isotope ratios far underground. The reflection in that still water is of a sky unchanged, the same stars appearing in the same positions, the same planets moving through the same constellations, the same Milky Way beginning to assert itself above the darkening horizon, a sky that offers no indication of whether the rains will return in their fullness next season, or whether the gradual shift recorded in the stone and sediment of the landscape will continue its quiet, unhurried work. The great pyramids stand above the canopy in the gathering darkness, their silhouettes unchanged against the star-filled sky, patient and enduring, holding within their limestone courses the warmth of a day that has passed and the weight of years that are, slowly and without drama, beginning to accumulate their consequence. There is a particular stillness that settles over a place that has been quiet for a very long time. Not the stillness of emptiness, which is merely the absence of sound, but something richer and more complex, a stillness that is itself a kind of presence, the accumulated silence of decades, layering over the stones and the plazas and the corbelled corridors, until the quiet becomes as palpable and as textured as the moss that spreads across the carved surfaces of the stelae, following the contours of the glyphs beneath, with a patience that mirrors, in its own biological way, the pursed patience of the civilization that carved them. The terminal classic period, spanning roughly 800 to 900 AD, is the era in which the great cities of the southern Maya lowlands completed their long, gradual transition from living urban centers to the forest-reclaimed ruins that modern archaeology has spent 2 centuries carefully uncovering and interpreting. This transition was not a single event or a sudden emptying, but a process as gradual and as incremental as the environmental pressures that contributed to it, a slow thinning of human presence, a declining frequency of new construction, a cessation of monument erection, a gradual withdrawal of the organizational energy that had for centuries held the jungle at bay and maintained the plazas and causeways and reservoir systems in their working condition. The forest, which had always been present at the margins, pressing inward with the patient insistence of something that knows it will eventually prevail, began its work of reclamation with the same unhurried inevitability that characterizes every process in this ancient landscape. At a site like Caracol in the Maya mountains of Belize, one of the largest classic Maya cities, whose agricultural terrace systems extended across an area of approximately 177 square kilometers, and whose population at its peak is estimated to have reached approximately 100,000 people. The physical evidence of this transition is visible in the archaeological record as a series of gradual changes rather than any single dramatic discontinuity. The construction of new monuments slows and then stops. The maintenance of the great reservoir system, which had required continuous labor to keep the channels clear and the basin linings intact, begins to lapse. The channels silting gradually, the plaster linings developing cracks that are no longer repaired, the carefully engineered catchment surfaces accumulating the leaf litter and organic debris that the wet season rains now wash into the reservoir basins rather than directing cleanly around them. The agricultural terraces on the surrounding hillsides, which had required constant maintenance to keep their retaining walls intact and their surfaces clear of the encroaching vegetation, begin to be reclaimed from their margins inward. The pioneer plants establishing themselves first in the corners and along the wall bases, then spreading across the terrace surfaces as the seasons pass without the labor that had previously kept them clear. The last dated monuments at the great southern lowland cities stand in the landscape as the most precise markers of this transition that the archaeological record preserves. Stones, whose long count inscriptions record specific dates in the late 800 SAD, after which no new monuments were erected, and the calendar that had been maintained in stone for centuries fell silent. At Tikal, the last securely dated monument, recording the date Kazarongting to approximately 1869 AD, a stela standing in the jungle that once formed the heart of one of the largest and most complex urban centers in the ancient Americas, its inscription still legible beneath the centuries of weathering and biological growth that have softened its carved surfaces, marking the final moment when the long count calendar was still being maintained and recorded at this site. At Quirigua, in the Motagua River Valley, the last monument dates to approximately 810 AD. At Copan, the last dated stela was erected around 822 AD. Its carved surfaces recording a date and a set of historical and cosmological references that no subsequent monument at that site would continue or extend. These final dates, distributed across the southern lowland cities within a span of roughly a century, trace the geography of the terminal classic transition with a precision that no other evidence quite matches. Each last monument a kind of punctuation mark at the end of a centuries-long inscription. The physical process by which the forest reclaims these spaces unfolds according to a sequence that is as orderly and as inevitable as the succession of seasons, each stage preparing the conditions for the next with the quiet efficiency of a system that has been operating in this landscape for millions of years. The first colonizers of the abandoned stone surfaces are the organisms that require the least, the crustose lichens that establish themselves on bare limestone within months of a surface being left unattended. Their thin, flat bodies spreading in slow circular patterns across the stone, their metabolic processes beginning the gradual chemical dissolution of the surface that will, across decades and centuries, roughen and pit the limestone in ways that create footholds for the organisms that follow. After the lichens come the mosses, soft, green, moisture-retaining mats that spread across the roughened stone surfaces in patterns that follow the contours of the carved glyphs beneath, the relief of the carving, creating the slight variations in moisture and shade that determine where the moss establishes most readily, so that the biological growth paradoxically traces and preserves the outlines of the inscription it is simultaneously obscuring. After the mosses, the ferns, their spores, carried on the wind from the surrounding jungle, germinating in the thin layer of organic material that the mosses have begun to accumulate on the stone surfaces, their roots probing the joints between limestone blocks with a delicacy that belies the force they will eventually exert. Then the shrubs, their seeds deposited by birds that perch on the monument summits and the palace rooflines, their root systems beginning to penetrate the mortar joints between the carefully fitted stone blocks with a patience and a persistence that no amount of engineering precision can indefinitely resist. And finally the trees, the pioneers first, the fast-growing species that colonize open ground and disturbed surfaces, their canopies, closing over the abandoned plazas within decades, their root systems spreading beneath the pavement stones, and beginning the slow work of displacement that will, across centuries, lift and tilt and eventually overturn the carefully laid limestone pavement of the great plazas. The ceiba tree, the sacred world tree of the Maya cosmological understanding, whose great spreading crown was understood as the canopy of the heavens and whose roots reach down into the underworld, participates in the reclamation of the abandoned cities with a particular physical force that is entirely silent and entirely irresistible. The buttressed roots of a mature ceiba, spreading outward from the base of the trunk in great radiating fins of pale wood, exert pressures on the stone structures they encounter that are measured not in sudden events, but in the slow, continuous application of biological force across decades and centuries, the root growing a fraction of a millimeter each day, the crack in the limestone block widening by the same fraction, the two processes locked together in a relationship whose outcome is never in doubt. At sites across the southern lowlands, the roots of grey trees can be seen embracing the stones of ancient walls and platforms in configurations that are simultaneously destructive and strangely beautiful, the pale wood of the root system flowing around and through the fitted limestone blocks in forms that seem almost deliberate, as though the tree had chosen to incorporate the ancient stonework into its own architecture. The corbelled arches of the palace corridors and temple rooms present a particular vulnerability to the processes of biological and hydrological reclamation. The corbelled arch achieves its structural integrity through the precise balance of compression forces, each cantilevered stone held in place by the weight of the structure above pressing down on it, the whole assembly stable, as long as every element remains in its designed position. When the root of a tree or the expansion of water, saturated mortar, displaces a single stone from this carefully balanced assembly, the redistribution of forces can initiate a cascade of displacement that moves through the structure with a slowness that makes it invisible to any single observer, but that is, across the span of decades, entirely inexorable. The corbelled ceilings of the abandoned palace rooms collapse inward in slow cascades that take centuries to complete. First a single block displaced, then the blocks that depended on it for their compression, balance, shifting slightly, then the accumulation of debris on the room floor, rising as the ceiling descends, the whole process unfolding with a quietness and a gradualness that is entirely in keeping with the character of everything else that happens in this patient landscape. The rainwater that falls on the abandoned city surfaces finds its way into the smallest cracks in the mortar between limestone blocks with a persistence that the original builders could not have anticipated and could not have prevented indefinitely. In the cooler highland sites, Copan, Palanque, the sites of the Maya highlands, the slight temperature variations between night and day cause this water to expand and contract within the cracks it has entered. the repeated cycling of this expansion and contraction widening the cracks by fractions of a millimeter with each cycle, the cumulative effect across hundreds of thousands of cycles being the gradual disaggregation of the mortar joints that hold the stone courses together. At the lowland sites, where temperature variation is less extreme, the biological processes of root penetration and organic acid dissolution accomplish the same work by different means, the outcome identical. The carefully fitted stonework of the classic Maya builders slowly returning to the condition of individual blocks, each one settling gradually into the forest floor as the structure that once held it in place dissolves around it. It is essential to the full understanding of this period to hold clearly in mind what the abandonment of the southern lowland cities was. It was not the end of the Maya civilization, not the disappearance of the Maya people, not even the cessation of Maya urban life across the full geographic range of the Maya world. The cities of the northern Yucatan, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Kabar, Sale, and the other great centers of the Puuc region continue to flourish well into the post-classic period, their architecture and their intellectual traditions maintaining continuity with the classic heritage while developing in new directions that reflected the changed political and environmental conditions of the post-collapse world. Chichen Itza, in particular, experienced a period of extraordinary florescence during the terminal classic and early post-classic periods. Its great monuments, El Castillo, the Temple of the Warriors, the Great Ball Court, representing a synthesis of Maya and broader Mesoamerican architectural and iconographic traditions that speaks to the continued vitality and adaptability of Maya culture, even as the southern lowland, heartland, was being released back to the forest. The Maya people themselves, of course, never disappeared. They continued as a living civilization across the full geographic range of the Maya world. Their descendants, numbering in the millions today across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Their languages, their agricultural traditions, their cosmological understanding, and their artistic sensibilities, maintaining deep continuities with the classic heritage, even through the disruptions of the Spanish conquest and the centuries of colonial transformation that followed. The abandonment of the great southern lowland cities was a transformation of the landscape of Maya civilization, a redistribution of its energies and its populations, a releasing of one particular expression of Maya urban ambition back to the forest from which it had been carved. But it was not, in any meaningful sense, an ending. The scholarly understanding of why the southern lowland cities were abandoned, when and how they were, has evolved considerably across the decades of research that have followed the initial archaeological investigations of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The current consensus, reflecting the accumulated evidence of paleoclimate research, archaeological excavation, palynological analysis, and the careful reading of the epigraphic record, points to a complex interaction of factors rather than any single cause. The prolonged droughts of the late 700s and early 800s, compounding the effects of agricultural soil degradation, the fragmentation of political relationships between cities that had previously maintained stabilizing networks of alliance and trade, the disruption of long-distance exchange systems that had moved obsidian, jade, marine shell, and other prestige materials across the Maya world, and the cumulative strain of supporting very large populations in a landscape that had been intensively modified across centuries of occupation. Each of these factors is visible in the physical record of the landscape. The isotope ratios in the cave formations, the sediment layers in the lake beds, the declining quality of terminal classic construction, the cessation of long-distance trade goods in the archaeological deposits of the late 800s, and each reinforces the understanding that what occurred was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual transformation, the crowned, slow resolution of accumulated tensions in a system that had been operating near the limits of its resilience for several generations. The forest that reclaims the abandoned plazas and palace corridors of the southern lowland cities does so with a completeness that, within a few centuries of the abandonment, renders the urban landscape almost entirely invisible beneath the canopy. The great pyramid temples, too massive and too solidly constructed to be fully dismantled by biological processes within any human time frame, continue to rise above the canopy as green-mantled hills, their original forms still present beneath the accumulated soil and vegetation of centuries, recognizable to the trained eye as the work of human hands rather than natural topography, but no longer legible as the architectural monuments they once were without the careful excavation that archaeology would eventually provide. The plazas below these pyramid hills become forest floor, the limestone pavement buried beneath accumulating debris, the stelae tilted and fallen and overgrown, the reservoir basins silted and forested, the causeways traceable only as faint paleness in the undergrowth, where the limestone gravel of their construction persists beneath the leaf litter. Tikal, at night, in the centuries after its last monument was carved and its last residents departed, presents a landscape of extraordinary quietness and extraordinary beauty, a beauty that belongs entirely to the forest and the sky. The human contribution to the scene, reduced to the dark silhouettes of the great pyramid temples rising above the canopy, their forms still unmistakably architectural against the star-filled sky overhead. The jungle reclaims the plazas below in the patient darkness. The roots of the great ceiba trees spreading beneath the limestone pavement, the moss advancing across the carved surfaces of the fallen stelae, the corbelled ceilings of the palace rooms descending in their slow, centuries-long cascade toward the debris-covered floors below. The reservoir surfaces, reduced now to shallow, silted depressions in the forest floor, no longer reflect the pyramid silhouettes above them, the mirror that once doubled the grandeur of the city's skyline, now replaced by the soft darkness of the forest floor. The water that once filled these basins, now moving through the underground passages of the limestone bedrock as it always has, indifferent to the engineering that once intercepted it. The stars overhead are unchanged, the same stars that the builders of Tikal watched with such careful attention, still arching overhead in their ancient patterns. Venus still blazing in the west, after sunset with the same intensity that made it the most carefully observed object in the classic Maya astronomical tradition, the Milky Way, still flowing from horizon to horizon in the broad, luminous river that the Maya understood as the world tree, the axis of the cosmos, the great ceiba of the heavens, whose roots reach down into the underworld and whose canopy spread across the sky. The Pleiades still rise at their precise angle above the eastern horizon in the spring months, marking the approach of the rainy season with the same reliability they have maintained across all the centuries of human observation, their helical rising, as accurate a signal of the agricultural calendar as it ever was, even in a landscape where the agricultural terraces have long since been reclaimed by the forest and the calendar that tracked them has fallen silent in stone. The forest breathes quietly in the darkness around the ancient pyramids, the canopy moving in the slight thermal currents of the tropical night, the howler monkeys silent at this hour, the nocturnal birds calling softly from the middle layers of the trees, the insects maintaining their continuous, layered chorus in the undergrowth. The stones of the great temples hold, within their limestone courses, the warmth of the day's sun, radiating it slowly into the cooling night air, with the same patient generosity they have maintained across 1,000 years of tropical days and tropical nights. The calcium carbonate of their ancient marine origins still conducting heat with the same physical properties it has always possessed, indifferent to the human history that shaped these particular stones into these particular forms. The carved glyphs on the fallen stele rest beneath their mantles of moss and lichen in the darkness of the forest floor, their meanings still encoded in the stone, their long count, dates still accurate, their astronomical correlations still correct, waiting with the serene patience of something built to endure for the light and the attention that will, in the fullness of time, find them again. The abandonment of the great southern lowland cities is, in the end, a story not of failure but of transformation. A long, gentle exhale after centuries of extraordinary creative effort, the releasing of a particular and magnificent expression of human ambition back into the keeping of the ancient landscape from which it was drawn. The jungle that reclaims these spaces does not erase what was built within them. It preserves it, encasing the stones in a biological matrix that, paradoxically, protects them from the weathering. That open exposure would accelerate, holding the carved surfaces and the architectural forms in a slow, cool darkness that has maintained them across a millennium with a fidelity that no human preservation effort could have matched. The forest is not the enemy of the ancient cities. It is their keeper, their archivist, the patient custodian of a record that it holds in trust for the scholars and the curious and the wondering who will, centuries later, push through the undergrowth and find the stone still there, still warm, still holding their mysteries, with the same composed and unhurried dignity with which this entire landscape has always held everything entrusted to it. At dawn, over Palenque, the mist arrives before the light does, filling the valley below the city's terraced platforms in slow, rolling waves of pale grey that move through the jungle with the unhurried confidence of something that has been performing this same ritual across every morning of every century since the limestone of these hills was first shaped by human hands. And the first light, when it comes, touches only the rooftop comb of the Temple of the Inscriptions, leaving the lower courses of the pyramid in cool shadow, while the summit catches the amber warmth of a sun that has not yet cleared the forested ridge to the east. This is the landscape of the Maya world as it exists now, not in the amber fullness of the classic peak, not in the jade green quietness of the terminal classic abandonment, but in a present that contains all of those previous states simultaneously, layered within the stones and the sediment and the living forest, like the pages of a book that has been pressed shut for 1,000 years and is only now, slowly and with extraordinary care, being opened and red. The Temple of the Inscriptions stands in its valley at Palenque with the same composed authority it has maintained since its construction in the late 7th century AD, its 9 terraced levels rising from the jungle floor with a precision of proportion that the centuries have not diminished, its carved surfaces holding within their limestone matrix the warmth of countless tropical mornings and the accumulated meaning of an inscription that, when it was finally deciphered in the 20th century, proved to contain one of the longest and most historically detailed texts in the entire Maya epigraphic record. The mist that fills the valley below it each morning is the same mist that the builders of this monument would have watched, rising from the same valley on the same mornings, the same atmospheric phenomenon, performing the same daily ritual across the full span of the centuries that separate their world from the present moment of contemplation. What the stones of the classic Maya world remember is not a single story, but a layered accumulation of stories: geological, biological, hydrological, astronomical, political, agricultural, each layer preserving its own kind of evidence in its own kind of medium, the whole archive, distributed across the landscape in forms that require different instruments and different disciplines to read, but that, when read together, begin to resolve into something approaching a coherent account of one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of human civilization. The limestone of the pyramid temples remembers the marine organisms whose accumulated shells and skeletons built it across millions of years of ancient ocean time, and it remembers the human hands that shaped it into these particular forms, and it remembers the centuries of tropical sun and rain that have weathered its surfaces since the last hands that maintained it withdrew, and it holds all of these memories simultaneously in its crystalline structure without hierarchy or preference, the geological and the human equally present in the same stone. The sediment cores drilled from the floors of ancient lake beds across the Maya lowlands remember the pollen of the forests that surrounded those lakes across the centuries of the classic period, the changing ratios of tree pollen to agricultural pollen, recording the advance and retreat of the forest margin with a precision that no written record could match, the biological archive of the lake sediments, preserving a continuous environmental history that extends from before the first Maya city was built to the present day. These cores, extracted with the careful methodology of modern paleoecological research, have been among the most important sources of evidence for understanding the environmental context of the classic Maya collapse, showing clearly the dramatic decline in forest cover during the late classic period, the acceleration of soil erosion during the centuries of maximum agricultural intensification, and the gradual recovery of the forest after the abandonment of the great cities, the tree pollen returning to dominance in the sediment record as the agricultural clearings closed over and the jungle reclaimed its territory. The cave formations of Belize and the Yucatan remember the rainfall of the past 2 millennia in the oxygen isotope ratios of their layered calcite, each thin lamination of stalagmite growth, recording the isotopic signature of the water that fed it, the ratio of heavy to light oxygen, varying with the amount of rainfall in ways that paleoclimatologists have learned to read with considerable precision. The record preserved in these formations shows the multi-year droughts of the late 700s and early 800s and early 800s AD with a clarity that makes their timing their severity legible across the distance of more than a millennium. The isotope values shifting toward the signatures of reduced rainfall across a period of decades, the signal of climatic stress accumulating in the stone with the same patient incrementalism that characterizes every other process of recording in this landscape. These cave records, cross-referenced with the evidence from lake sediment cores and marine sediment cores from the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, have provided the paleoclimate foundation for the current scholarly understanding of the role that prolonged drought played in the complex of pressures that contributed to the terminal classic transformation. The scholarly understanding of what happened to the classic Maya cities of the southern lowlands during the terminal classic period has itself undergone a transformation across the decades of research that have followed the initial archaeological investigations, moving from the dramatic single cause explanations that characterized earlier scholarship toward the more nuanced, multi-factor understanding that the accumulated evidence now supports. Simon Martin of the Penn Museum, among many other scholars who have devoted careers to the study of the classic Maya collapse, has articulated the emerging consensus that what occurred was the result of multiple interacting pressures: prolonged drought, agricultural soil degradation, the fragmentation of political relationships between cities, disruption of trade networks, and the cumulative strain of supporting very large populations in a landscape that was reaching the limits of its carrying capacity. None of these factors sufficient alone to produce the transformation that occurred, but together creating a compounding of vulnerabilities that the system could not indefinitely absorb. This understanding, as Martin and others have noted, is in some ways a calmer and more human story than the dramatic single cause narratives that once dominated popular accounts of the collapse, a story of a civilization navigating the consequences of its own success, of a landscape responding to the demands placed upon it, of a complex system finding a new equilibrium after a period of stress that exceeded its resilience. The physical traces of each of these contributing factors are legible in the landscape of the Maya world for those who know how to read them. The evidence of prolonged drought is preserved in the cave formations and lake sediments. The evidence of agricultural soil degradation is visible in the sediment cores from the Copan Valley and other intensively cultivated areas, where the layers of fine clay deposited by accelerated erosion mark the centuries of maximum agricultural pressure with unmistakable clarity. The evidence of political fragmentation is encoded in the epigraphic record, the increasing frequency of warfare references in the late classic inscriptions, the disruption of the alliance networks that had connected the great cities across the centuries of the classic peak, the cessation of the long-distance exchange of prestige goods that had bound the